Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome or welcome back, again, as the case might be. My name is Dalibor Petrovic. I'm a partner at Deloitte. And over the last couple of years, I have had the pleasure to host this series of conversations that are relevant to specifically Canadian technology leadership audience and enterprise tech enthusiasts. Today, we have a very special conversation. Today, we are going to be discussing a very, very important topic to our country as a whole, the topic of workforce development and workforce upskilling in Canada. Deloitte has recently published a large piece of research, a report on digital equity in Canada, and we have identified that part of a major challenge that we have as a country is in the lagging of upskilling our workforce for the skills that are essential to be successful in today's economy, and quite frankly, more importantly, of course, for tomorrow's economy. And to unpack this challenge and talk about some ideas and some solutions, today I'm joined by two very special guests. I believe exactly the right people for the topic. I'm pleased to welcome Jake Hirsch-Allen. Jake is the North American Workforce Development and Higher Ed System Lead at LinkedIn. Jake, thank you very much for finding the time to join us for this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you join. And then Benoit Hardy-Vallée, a partner of mine at Deloitte, and a gentleman who leads our learning strategy and innovation practice at Deloitte. So Benoit, thank you very much for joining us as well.
No better place to be right now.
Excellent, excellent.
Great battle.
And for our audience members, this is a live conversation. So I invite you to join the conversation using the Q&A function of this Zoom platform. The session will also be recorded, and I will send the link to everyone following the session. So let's jump into the conversation. What we know is that skills shortages we're experiencing in Canada have become quite structural and widespread. And what we are still seeing is that our employers, both governments and private sector employers, are underinvesting in the development of Canadian workforce. As a matter of fact, some pretty sad statistics that in 2021, so a few years back when the latest figures came out, Canada ranked number 25 of 29 countries that within the scope of OECD in terms of businesses investing in upskilling, reskilling their workforce. So this is seriously surprising to me when I see. I had, quite frankly, assumed that we as a highly developed first world country would be better at this, given how important workforce skill sets is. So what I would like to do is let's get into the conversation. Maybe Jake, a question for you first to get us going. How is this reality that Canada has been underinvesting in our own workforce and skill development? How is this situation impacting our overall productivity and our overall global competitiveness?
It's a great question, and it's one that does not get enough attention, in part, I think, because it's not perhaps as sexy as AI or even, as sort of global as climate change, but rather for Canada in particular, I think it is perhaps the single most important question, certainly as it relates to productivity. So our country for a long time now has been obsessed with the fact that our productivity rates have been falling. In fact, they too are amongst the worst in the OECD over time in terms of sort of the delta of change. And the single reason that is most clear for that fall in productivity is a lack of education on the job, a lack of employers training their employees. And I think this is particularly true in a country where we have a huge percentage of the total businesses being small to medium-sized businesses. And what Canada calls a small to medium-sized business is even smaller than what many countries do. So we're really talking quite small businesses here that haven't either been provided the incentives or themselves haven't built the culture or the risk tolerance to invest in their employees, specifically around training and education. And if we were doing that, as far as I can tell, and as far as study after study, now we're talking for decades, have shown, it could be the single most powerful ingredient to increasing Canada's productivity, because we have so many of the other factors for success, the other ingredients. We're just lacking training after higher education. We have an incredible higher education system, and yet we sort of treat it as if you're going to batch load education at the beginning of one's career, and then employers forget about it. And part of the huge push for everything from work integrated learning to hybrid forms of online and offline learning are because the government and even some major private sector actors have been desperate to find a way to get employers to train their employees in Canada.
This is very good. And Jake, when you started describing this, I realized something that actually wasn't as apparent to me before. You're linking this issue with the fact that majority of Canadian economy actually is driven by medium and small size companies. That actually, now I can see the issue here, that small and medium sized companies by definition might not have the resources, but also the strategies and tactics and so forth, but the resources to put into this. Jake, perhaps what we could do is, I would love to actually get a little bit more about you and your background, and why is this so important for you personally?
Yeah, happy to jump in. I sort of, over the past couple months, have been really thinking hard about what got me into education and training, into workforce development in the first place. And the conclusion that I came to, because it was a very organic transition from a past life as a public international lawyer, I've started my career doing very different things, defending war criminals in The Hague and Cambodia, clerking at the Supreme Court of Israel, coming back to Canada to do intellectual property law, and proving, interestingly, that I am a terrible lawyer. I don't have the adversarial instinct. I don't have the detail orientation to be a good lawyer. And in part, I think it was that process of self-discovery that helped a lot in terms of focusing the remainder of my career on education and workforce development, because in some ways I had gotten not the wrong education in the sense that I really value my law degree and it's been really helpful in other aspects of my life, but rather I took the wrong things from that education. And this is, I think, a much more common problem, that people are unable to identify the skills that they have, the areas that they're interested in. And so I really became obsessed with that combination of education and career development that represents sort of training and workforce development. And it started out with things like running a software company that couldn't hire enough software developers. So we started a boot camp that now is the largest software boot camp in Canada, Lighthouse Labs, or working with Gordon Brown because everybody had been talking about online learning and massive open online courses 10, 15 years ago. And yet they weren't actually having the impact on the developing world that folks like the United Nations had long thought they would, UNESCO and others. And so Gordon Brown, former UK PM, at this point acting in his capacity as UN Special Advisor for Education, was trying to work with me and a group of others. We had pulled together the early Coursera's and edX's and Mozilla badging platforms, you name it, from 15 years ago, to figure out how this online learning could impact people, again, in the developing world. And it was an amazing preview of what happened during COVID, where I think we realized the tech can't solve these problems, but the importance of training and education cannot be overstated. And so we still are struggling with that sort of human versus computer divide. But if anything, the certainty that training and education are the ticket to lifting folks in the developing world out of poverty and helping Canadians stay at sort of the front of the curve is now without a doubt, I think.
Yeah. And you mentioned this this lagging position that we are in. What are those key barriers that you feel leaders face when it comes to employee learning and upskilling in Canada specifically?
I mentioned risk aversion earlier, and I think that is perhaps the greatest problem that industry in Canada has writ large. We have succumbed to what many other countries with tons of resources have succumbed to, which is a degree of passivity, of reliance on those natural resources, instead of building the sort of creative, innovative tendencies inside us. And while there are significant exceptions, I mean, Toronto does have, I think, the third largest tech sector in the world. And Canada as a whole actually has an equally large problem about singing our own praises, right? About having the confidence to actually speak about all of the amazing things that we are doing. But I think perhaps even greater than that self-confidence issue, and related, of course, is this risk aversion where companies aren't willing to pay upfront to invest in their employees, even though every study shows that doing so will actually result in higher productivity in the long term and very substantial returns on investment.
Hmm. And do you see any differences across the country depending on organizational sizes or industries or geographies or regions?
100%. I just got back from Halifax, and there's no question that sort of the history of the fisheries industry, or even the history of Canada in terms of that being really sort of the first place that settlers came, and its much longer relationship between settlers and Indigenous folks, et cetera, has resulted in a very different economy on the East Coast to that on the West Coast. For instance, we've been working a lot with the SDC on delivery benefits, or benefits delivery, excuse me, on sort of unemployment insurance and other benefits. And the East Coast, again, looks quite different than the rest of the country, in part because of the seasonal nature of their work, because of the fact that the fishing industry has taken such a hit over the years, et cetera. And so I think there's no question that we have very distinct regions in Canada, also just because of our size. How many other countries have, five time zones and industries spanning the Arctic all the way down to fisheries, or farming all the way into forestry? And so I think, yes, massive regional differences. And if we want to tie it back to our history, it's really the financial centers of Montreal and Toronto driving the economy based on the resources coming out of the rest of the country that paint the picture of our history. And yet we're at a turning point. There's no question. We can't continue to rely on those resources moving forward, because with every year, our lead decreases, right? We are not necessarily falling behind in every metric. Certainly on training and education, we are behind. But on others, like productivity, we will get further and further behind unless we do more training and education for our employees.
Jake, I think that you've established a very compelling context here. Benoit, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And maybe before we start with the question that I would like to ask you is, like, what are those initiatives that you are familiar with, that you know, that both governments and private sector companies are instituting or running to help sort of with this closure of the skills gap? But Benoit, maybe before you answer the question, I'd love to, if you could just give us maybe a little bit about who you are and what you do at the firm.
Absolutely. So right now I have the pleasure of working with our Canadian client on upskilling, learning transformation, and even learning programs, right? So, and it goes from rethinking how learning happens to actually building some capability academies in some focused areas. And I think a bit like Jake, who went from potentially being a lawyer to being something else. I started in life thinking I would be a philosophy teacher, and then after a couple of postdoc, ended up in the real world, Googling myself, what can I do with a PhD in philosophy? And I guess this is how I got a taste for the upskilling, right? I mean, the need not only to learn new things, but also to see how you can transfer what you know. Because, I mean, I was obviously useless on day one, no doubt about that. But I did realize over time that learning lots of mental models, frameworks, ways of thinking is actually extremely useful. So you learn how to build that. And I think this is also one of the barriers we face sometimes in workforce development nowadays. We have this very process-based approach to recruitment or job matching. There's a laundry list of things you want people to have, typically designed by a committee. You try to match and find that purple, unicorn. And of course, nobody fit the description. But if you go a bit deeper, if you think about, capabilities, enduring human capabilities like curiosity, empathy, willingness, ability to learn, there are many things that people can learn and can be coached, right? If you hire people with the right desire and motivation, if you give them an environment where they can learn and be mentored and coached, and there's work integrated learning or learning in the flow of work, you can actually ramp up people. But again, we need the investment. And as Jake mentioned, we're We're a bit cautious, I think, culturally. We're a very cautious culture and country. Even our largest organization, in professional service and due to our legacy, I think we take very measured step. I often joke that a lot of my clients are asking me for a chip, or that you put in your brain and it takes zero time, but yet you have absolute knowledge. We don't have that; it's in the pipeline, but we need to come to the realization that we need to invest. It will cost time and effort, but it will pay out.
Payback, yeah.
And I think maybe Europe is a bit more willing to invest. The USA's might be a bit more willing to take the risk, and we're sort of a bit stuck in the middle.
We're a bit stuck in, yeah, exactly.
Completely
So,
agree. Dalibor, I have
go
a
ahead.
couple examples that I think might illustrate what Ben was describing, because I think
Please.
he's nailing the biggest challenges here. And my examples, I'm trying to here span a bunch of different circumstances, because part of it, we both have hinted at the challenge of communicating one's skills appropriately. And my favorite example in this respect, as a nation of newcomers, right? As a nation of folks who have primarily come from overseas. My mother was a refugee. We've sponsored 4 or 5 refugee families, and that is like a uniquely Canadian phenomenon that I think really is a model for the world, both from humanitarian perspective, but also from a skills perspective. And the reason I say it in that respect is twofold. There's this group called Talent Lift that's doing this really cool thing where they're going into refugee camps and they're finding individuals with skills who are applying for refugee visas, and then they're matching them to economic visas because they have the skills that Canada's looking for. And so they're fast tracking these folks into Canada because they both have the humanitarian need and the economic benefit. But equally importantly, they're highlighting how, as an example, if you have a mother refugee shepherding a family of 4 across 3 borders, she's building project management, communication, demonstrating resilience, leadership, all of these skills that are incredibly in demand, often much more in demand than the technical skills. The problem is we A, have to help her communicate them, and B, certify her for some of them, offer fire assessed learning or other opportunities to fast track her into the economy, because right now we don't have a problem with folks coming into the economy. Rather, we have a problem with getting them into the right jobs. And this comes to sort of the second point of what Benoit was hinting at around the necessary sort of innovativeness or creativity of companies in reallocating their own employees into more efficient roles, in part via training, identifying that they have an aptitude, that they have some skills, but that there's a gap to get them from where they are into much more efficiency rather than firing and trying to hire again into that role. And that training is the answer to that gap. And I think one of the challenges we have is the ability to perceive a person in more than one light, from more than one perspective. So as an example, during COVID, all of these hosts and servers who were no longer serving folks inside a restaurant often adapted, and you had them, let's say, making signs for where they could instead find the right window to pick up their food. Well, perhaps that allowed the company to discover that they were a great graphic designer, and the smart companies moved those individuals into graphic design roles, and they moved on up the ladder within the corporation. The dumb companies, even sort of the less effective SMBs, left them as servers and returned them to being hosts post-pandemic. And so I think examples like that, where we're really able to be dynamic enterprises and to see people as more than their current title or education, is going to be determinative of whether we're able to then inject training to accelerate their progress and sort of the productivity and growth of these companies.
And maybe one last example I would also throw in the mix is I would call it the rebirth of corporate universities. I found that recently there's an increased amount of curiosity and desire to think, well, maybe I should invest in something that is more of a structure, permanent, with of course content that can evolve, because there has been the famous corporate university, the GE, the McDonald. I mean, they still exist. But now I have clients who want to refresh their universities, or even building one, or learning centers for trades, for knowledge worker. Like, you could tell the market is preparing because they don't necessarily have the skills from talent acquisition. So the discussion is shifting from acquiring talent to building it in-house at a pace that is typically faster than what the market or the education system can provide.
I love that. And I think maybe one last point. Sorry, Dalibor, we'll let
No,
you
absolutely.
answer the
Yeah.
question.
This is fascinating stuff.
But one last point on the fact that the skills that folks are looking for, because I mentioned this earlier, but I think it bears repeating, are not just the technical skills. Rather, those are the easiest ones to assess. Those are the easiest ones to describe. We can associate them relatively obviously with a particular job, with labor market information that describes the labor market as a whole, but we neglect the more important ones. Almost every study shows the human skills, the softer, essential, or everybody has their own name for it. I think in the States, the most popular one right now is the durable skills. But irrespective, those are the skills that we need to be emphasizing both for post-secondary training so that folks can communicate what they're getting out of post-secondaries and then express it on the job, but as importantly for on-the-job training. And one example, I'm working with this think tank called The Dais, which is based at Toronto Metro University. And we have a project with a bunch of other think tanks from across the country to help large employers, beginning with large employers, and eventually we hope all employers, to build some of those soft skills specifically around pushing back on the misinformation and disinformation coming from the internet, coming from sort of social networks and a variety of other potential online harms, and building instead the muscles around civic engagement, around critical thinking, around independent thinking, and sort of building a consensus in society in a civic square. And those are pretty abstract ideas and skills. But I think what we've seen by neglecting them, perhaps in favor of tech or technical skills, is that there are crucial aspects of society that are breaking down, much like, you know, the authors of Bowling Alone, Putnam, described would happen 10, 15 years ago. So again, let's emphasize those soft skills, not just the technical ones, and let's make sure that employers are leveraging initiatives like this one from the Dais called Leaders for Democracy, Leaders Defending Democracy, that will really focus on helping employers train their employees in these durable human skills.
Now, you mentioned a few of these durable human skills. By the way, I agree with you 100%. As a matter of fact, how I would think of this is you're hiring vessels of potential, right? You're hiring the vessel of potential, and then you're investing in reshaping that vessel into the type of a contributor that is needed at the moment. You're almost like walking away from the concept of a specialist and instead hiring this let's call it a vessel of potential, and creating a serial specialist, someone that would be serially upskilled over the course of their career as needed in multiple sequentially value increasing kind of roles, right?
100%. It's as if the human being is not the ingredient, but I love that analogy of a vessel because it goes thousands and thousands of years back, right? Since the earliest cave paintings, we have seen humans represented as vessels. I think for exactly the reason you're describing, we can contain many things at once.
Yeah. Now, just before we go off the topic, I would love, because I have some points of view on sort of what are those skills that we're looking for, durable skills, this enduring, what used to be known as soft, what people are realizing are the hardest skills, I think. What are the some that you feel are critical to have or to develop in that sense?
So one I would draw right away, because I don't think we talk about it enough. I mean, I think social collaboration, empathy, to me, it's almost a given now. There has been a lot of conversation about that. I think about imagination. And it goes with curiosity, but I think this is one that maybe didn't have enough attention or care, because imagination drives innovation, but not just the big patent granting innovation, right? It's innovating how you run a project differently, how you see a situation differently. And I think we need to build that muscle, this agility in our workforce. And this is truly a gift. I mean, everyone who work with a really imaginative person, I mean, not too imaginative because you don't want to derail the project, but if you have a good problem solver and somebody who likes to think outside of the proverbial box, it's truly a gift having somebody like that on your team. And I think sometimes, depending on background and the education system, we format people to be good at following rules, which has a lot of value, don't get me wrong. But even within the context of rules, even in the army, right? You need to have people who can think creatively and solve
Yeah.
problems. So I think it's bringing a little bit of that. And I always recall one of my teacher who was saying, quoting, I don't know who, that if you want to have new ideas, read old books, right? So going into the vast seas, to stay in the metaphor, seas of knowledge that humanity created, and drawing inspiration from different area, from theater and the arts,
Yeah.
and bringing that into the workforce. I think it makes work more fun, but also it helps solve.
I completely agree. And interestingly, what you said about our ability to discern information from this vast sea of information is, I think, also a uniquely 21st century skill, in the sense that never until the internet did humanity have all of the world's information, so to speak, at their fingertips. And the result is that we are all able to make decisions and in some cases come to conclusions that require many more of those human skills, because we need the critical thinking. We need to be able to understand what is actually evidence versus not truth, to get back to this misinformation, disinformation, but also my favorite example of what could go wrong as Gen AI writes more of the internet, creates more of the images and audio on the internet, as we create those things via Gen AI. My worry in part is that we are sort of bringing everyone down to the average, because it doesn't create the best or the worst. It creates the average of everything that we've created. And if we can't tell that, we might lose some of the incredible diversity that has defined humanity for a very long time.
Yeah.
Which makes, to Benoit's point, the idea of critical thinking even more important, the ability of sifting through that ocean of information for the key nuggets that actually will differentiate your organization, your company, your institution. That is almost a new skill, at least to the extent that it is important now.
It is absolutely new skill. You're absolutely right. And actually, I never thought about it in this perspective, from that angle, but you're absolutely right. Everybody has all the world's knowledge in their hand. How do you actually figure out what's the right information? Yeah, absolutely, it's wonderful. Technology has made huge impact to this. And the ed tech that is emerging too. I want to touch on that a little bit. Maybe Benoit, you can help us sort of understand a little bit more about the landscape of the ed tech and its potential and its impact, and like what are some of the innovative solutions that you are seeing emerging in ed tech space that could help in this regard?
Yeah, well, and you see a lot of VC money going into that, right? Which is always a good sign that there's a desire to improve and transform. So I think it's fair to say that for many years, ed tech, or learning tech at least, was limited to your good old LMS. It's a system of process, compliance, you track it. A few years ago, we studied emergence of learning experience management. So that has a bit of the Amazon and the Netflix and the Shopify type of experience, where the content finds you and it's personalized. And now you even have adaptive learning, where instead of learning everything you have to learn, you take a test and see if there are gaps, and you only learn the gaps. So it's technology that's becoming more and more purposeful, centered on the learning, and under that broader umbrella. I mean, you have everything nowadays. If you think about frontline learner, for many years they were neglected by LMS providers because it wasn't convenient. Now you have mobile first application that have a TikTok-esque feeling, right? Where it's very intuitive, it's short, it's engaging. You can do that in between two shifts. It uses a lot of neuroscience to create habits of learning, because nobody has the patience nor the time to watch 1 hour videos. Like, that's not going to happen. Maybe during the pandemics, but sometimes maybe people had time, but for sure it won't happen. Classroom training is also expensive and sometimes challenging to organize, but going to the extreme is not right. So it's breaking down learning into different components, which also bring another one, and I'm sure Jake can tell us a lot about that, but micro learning, right? Snackable learning, little moment of learning that can happen either via the technology or other means.
Totally. And as Benoit was mentioning in our pre-call, learning in the flow of work is hands down, we know the best way for the vast majority of people to learn. right? Everybody does learn slightly differently. Everybody's on a spectrum. For instance, some of us, my brother, learns way better online than offline. The irony is, when we were at McGill at the same time, I would sit in the massive auditorium, desperately waving my hand to participate. My brother would sit across the street in a coffee shop watching the exact same lecture on his laptop because he learned better that way. And so we all sort of fall on these spectrums. That's online to offline. The same is true for work integrated or in the flow of learning, et cetera. All long-standing pedagogical principles that we're now trying to adapt to a world that is hyper fast-paced, that requires massive amounts of adaptability and discernment to get through all this information. But I wanted to list a few examples because I am always torn between these two poles, increasingly, I would even argue, torn between these two poles of the wonders of EdTech and its potential and the reality of EdTech and how it may be in some ways failing us. And so maybe I'll start with the dark side and then end on the light side.
Yeah, of course.
But about a year ago, I was at a UNESCO event. It was their Digital Learning Week. It's one of the biggest global events on online learning of the year. It's in Paris, and the event centered around this classically UN 500-page report. But in this case, I actually think people not only are going to, but have already begun reading it because two things. One, it captured in its title the tragedy of EdTech during COVID. And two, in its format, it was not only incredibly accessible, giving really tragic examples of how folks had promised the moon and ended up actually harming populations by rolling out large-scale EdTech, or just claiming that Zoom was online learning when, practically speaking, we hadn't provided faculty members with any training, let alone students, on how to use it and how to learn that way. So that was the tragedy, but it was even written in the form of a Greek tragedy. It is like it came across in this narrative fashion, which again, education has, I think, begun to lose as we get too technical. So that's the dark side. The light side, on the other hand, is the dozens of startups that are desperately trying to leverage what they know is technology that can help us with learning. And as Benoit was suggesting, use it, bake it into the flow of work so that the reason LinkedIn Learning is most always, I mean, for the decade I was with LinkedIn and am with LinkedIn, it's always the top course is Excel. Why? Because somebody is in Excel trying to figure out how to use a function, and they flip over to LinkedIn Learning, they watch 80 seconds of how to use that function, and then they go back. And so here, Benoit, maybe I'll turn it over to you before going through my list of startups. But Dalibor, just before we move on to the next topic, I'd love to go through a few of the examples of, again, how EdTech is at least trying to solve challenges.
And I think the only one I would add is obviously with Gen AI, it just accelerated a lot of the project, a lot of the integration, the data management, and so on. So I think, and we are seeing emerging a couple of new players that bring either the generative side of AI, so that you can have a tutor, you can teach a GPT on a specific topic, it's becoming your personal coach. Of course, we would rather have human contact, but there are cases where it makes sense for a specific skill, especially if you don't have a great network or it's outside of working hours, having that conversational like exchange with somebody who's trained on your need and the topic that you need to learn, on top of improving the speed and quality of content creation. Again, not that we want to create 1-hour videos, but if we can make them short, built with the best knowledge of learning, adult learning principles and the content you're trying to build, well, that is, and it's happening as we speak, right? I mean, in the last 6 months, you see so many new startups just for content creation, leveraging what marketing has already started to do.
Yeah, but it's interesting, Benoit. I think marketing is a great example of where education is still experimenting and trying to figure out the pros and cons of Gen AI, right? Post-secondary right now are desperately trying to figure out how to deal with students, not necessarily cheating, but just using ChatGPT to write things or brainstorm, et cetera. Similarly, there's these huge opportunities for assessment. You can all of a sudden automatically create a personalized assessment for every student just by asking ChatGPT to do it. But that comes with all sorts of risks associated with hallucination, where the information is coming from, et cetera. And so I think you're right. Gen AI has really accelerated both extremes of this spectrum, the pros and the cons. As I said, I wanted to give a few examples of the organizations I'm working with because I think they give the spectrum of EdTech. So like the one that I've been perhaps most closest to as a side gig from my day job at LinkedIn has been as a board member for a spin-out of Ontario Tech University called Talent. And the idea here was post-secondaries haven't been able to create educational content or programs at the pace that tech is changing, that society is changing, in part because of the government-led restrictions on new program development, new degrees, certificates. And so I've spent a lot of the past decade focused on micro-credentials, and these folks have been able, Ontario Tech Talent has been able to spin up micro-credentials in response to employer demand faster than anyone else in Canada, as far as I can tell. And so as a result, they have folks in the energy industry, in the healthcare industry, who first come to them and say, we have these 500 employees who we need to move into these roles, help us build the micro-learning that will enable them on the job to get from here to there. And they're doing that in the industries that need that kind of upskilling most urgently. So I think that's one key example. But interestingly, they are pivoting from just a focus on content, which is rapidly becoming democratized, to, in addition, a focus on the skills data that these organizations need, the insights that they need in order to use that content because the vast majority of the energy companies are saying, hey, we have all these folks, but we don't actually know what the path is from here to there. In fact, in many cases, we don't even know what skills our own workforce has because that data is not particularly robust, relying on older public labor market information, et cetera. So that's one. A couple other examples. Future Fit AI is one of a number of startups I'm advising that have mastered the use of AI to do some of the career advice that Benoit was suggesting earlier. Because the data on what skills are associated with jobs is becoming a lot more robust, and because we can get a much faster portrait of an individual, even conversationally using a chatbot, we are therefore able to match those two and provide folks with career advice on the fly. Again, to Benoit's point, we should not be replacing career developers. If anything, one of the few areas in our economy that I think we should be tripling down instead of just doubling down is on paying for career support, whether in post-secondaries, in the workforce development system, or on the job. But those career developers who are seeing way more folks than they can handle can be supported by this software that provides them and their clients with a much better picture of the labor market and matching of their skills and ambitions to it. And then there's a whole slew of others doing student service work, one called trees.app that again is using Gen AI to specifically deliver student services within post-secondaries better. Another called Campus Evolve in a very similar space, taking a bunch of services that post-secondaries already deliver relatively efficiently and adding Gen AI to allow them to get those in front of students more effectively. I can keep going, but I'll stop for now.
What is clear is that there's a whole ecosystem that exists that supplements traditional higher ed institutions. So when you zoom out and look at this whole ecosystem, I think it's apparent that there's opportunity to mix and match, to engage. Could you comment on that? How do we bring together different stakeholders? How do companies do this well?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what we've talked about as of yet is very private sector focused. And I think we should be clear, the burden should not be entirely on companies. Rather, it's about each sector of Canada coming together to focus on how to remove the obstacles to this, perhaps the single most important factor in productivity. And so in the States, interestingly, where the divides between labor and government and the private sector are perhaps even greater than in Canada, there are nevertheless some really interesting examples that I think we can learn from. And one of them, actually, the Prime Minister, I think late last week went down, or maybe this week, to California to visit, or to the States to visit the largest union, SEIU, which is sort of healthcare workers union. And I pinged his office to suggest that it was important that they look at a few of the models that SEIU has been experimenting in exactly the area that we're talking about today, training on the job and upskilling into really in-demand jobs. Because as we know, personal support workers, tertiary healthcare workers, amongst the most in-demand areas of every developed economy in the world as healthcare costs and needs increase dramatically and as our populations age. And so that's in part the population that SEIU, this union, covers. And they got together with the California Community College System, which was seeing not enough people go into these programs, and more importantly, far too few people leaving there early healthcare worker programs and actually getting into jobs, and a huge skew in terms of the demographics of those individuals. The drop-off rate was far higher for newcomers, for non-white folks, for non-men, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so they were trying to figure this out. And the CCCC system, California Community College, SEIU, this union, and Kaiser Permanente, the largest healthcare employer in America, got together to create this incredible experiment where Kaiser agreed to drop a lot of their interviewing and entry requirements, as long as the union and the post-secondary were able to assess the individual having those skills. And what that did was it removed the formal and informal barriers, formal being, for instance, a degree requirement or a number of years of experience requirement, informal being the subjective bias in that interview process. And as a result, way more folks from marginalized communities are getting into these jobs. It's one of the most effective initiatives to get folks through a community college system and into jobs in American history. And in my opinion, it is a great example of exactly what Dalibor is asking, how different industries have to come together in order to create these successes. It's not just government taxes, sometimes it's government incentives. It's sometimes economic development organizations forming ecosystems with library systems and workforce development systems that, when they connect, are actually enabling the effective change that we've been talking about today.
And it's finding the right connective tissue. Is it a joint problem? Is it in a location? Is it in an industry, right? Once you triangulate all that, then you can align people the right way. I had colleagues who have been doing that with the mining sector in one of the Canadian province. You had, again, the government, the private sector, the educational institution, and even us as their advisor coming together and strategize. We have a clear skill gap. We look at the future, it's only going to get worse. What are the things we can do today? And then let's divide and conquer. But if every single mining organization try to solve that, they're going to spend a lot more time spinning, trying to figure it out, versus coming together and say, look, we might be competitor, but we all want the same thing. We want the province to prosper. So what if we find a way of collaborating?
Yeah. So certainly what I'm getting is that the answer here is to actually, first of all, understand what is available, who is doing what in the ecosystem, and then using the imagination capabilities of our vessels, figure out the way to actually connect into the system, and that the system actually should be viewed just like what it says, an ecosystem. It includes governments, it includes economic development, it includes higher ed, it includes private sector, it includes innovators. Your job is to combine this and figure out a way to make it work. So Benoit, maybe both you, Benoit and Jake, I would love if you could share maybe some good examples of organizations, perhaps in Canada, that are doing a good job, doing workforce development and upskilling their workforce. Are there any good examples that we can discuss?
Many. Benoit, I'll let you go first.
Well, the one that comes to mind, and again, not necessarily sharing names, but a well-known aerospace manufacturing company operating in Canada, they are starting to build their own trade school, right? Just because for years they have been a bit outsourcing some of that to technical colleges. So you join a company, your dream is to start building, machines and engines, and then you have to go sit for 3 months in a school, and then you come back and you learn, good material and all that, not necessarily appropriate to the kind of structure you're going to build, the kind of machine you're going to build. So it's bringing that in-house and then building short learning path, maybe 5 or 6 weeks, so that when you join the organization, you are formatted the right way. You have the knowledge, not just of the technologies, but also the culture and the broader manufacturing life cycle, for example. So I think they're doing quite a great work. I've seen a few other trade training organization going the same path. So I think that, as I mentioned earlier, with internal schools and corporate university, I see the shift going in this direction.
Jake.
A few other examples. So on behalf of LinkedIn, much of the past decade for me has been focused on public-private partnerships. So the government of Ontario bought 1 million licenses of LinkedIn Learning about 6-7 years ago and provided them to every one of the 45 post-secondaries in this province. And the result was over 300,000 people watching a video in the first 6 months, which I don't think would have dramatically changed all of their careers, but rather probably taught many of them how to learn online in advance of a pandemic that forced all of us to. Or in BC, lots of SMBs unable to access LinkedIn Learning because of its cost. Well, we worked with Innovate BC to actually create learning pathways for dozens of different categories of the SMBs that they support. And then they purchased LinkedIn Learning licenses on behalf of those SMBs. The state of Texas using our recruiting software to help match folks to jobs more efficiently, because we have this massive database of 1 billion members of information, plus basically every job in the world. And we can help governments to do that matching more effectively. Maybe one last example from Ontario, where really interesting ecosystem collaborations. I saw one of the questions in the chat, and please do continue to put questions into the chat because it was a fantastic one, was on how do we help get SMBs to access resources that they can use to do this training, because the vast majority of them don't have the capacity built in, the money built in, the software or the content. And in Ontario, in partnership with groups like Contact North, which have done unbelievable distance learning in collaboration with groups like eCampus Ontario, we, LinkedIn and others, have helped businesses access the content, the training coming out of our public post-secondaries, turn it into the kind of bite-sized training that can be accessed in the flow of work, and then ensuring that even the most remote Indigenous community-run businesses have access to that training because they can go into a local town, download the content, and then view it offline, or now with Starlink, they're able to access it in their actual communities.
Fantastic. And we actually do get a comment also on the Q&A. Someone listening in confirms that they are the users of LinkedIn Learning in their organization. So clearly the things have changed drastically in the last, well, couple of decades for sure, where now we, I think, all agree that we live in this continuous learning environment, and that one of the probably key aspects of job security is for people to be open to continuous learning, right? I'm assuming that there are some good practices emerging, how organizations ought to think about this in general. So I'm not sure, Jake and Benoit, like let's say as a chief learning officer for an organization or somebody tasked for solving this, are there some like good practices? Are there some emerging, frameworks, how people ought to be approaching this? You mentioned the challenge with even knowing what skill sets do we have, then figuring out what are the skill sets do we need. Like, can anyone maybe take that on? Like, what is emerging as a good practice? What do you see your nation follow to get this right?
I think what may have been missing for years, and again, we might need 3 or 4 hours to get to the bottom of this, but I think for many years, a lot of organizations were less diligent in workforce strategy, or you had operational workforce strategy replace the headcount. Now, with all these transformation and AI, it's less about replacing the workforce and more shaping it. So rather than people in, people out, it's thinking about the capabilities, which could be skills or automation. And having the right connections between your strategic workforce strategies activity and your learning. The less mature organization administer learning as a process. Well, here's the menu, help yourself. We track completion, we track usage, which one was the most popular, are people happy, and so on. The more mature will start to ask, what are the skills we need to be successful in 5 years? What are we doing to build these skills internally? And this is where the job of the chief learning officer starts, making sure we build the right skills in the internal skills ecosystem for future success.
Yeah, I mean, I think Benoit's nailing it. The biggest challenge, even for the largest companies in the world right now, is if they have the best internal labor management software, from Workday to LinkedIn, from like, you name it, HRIS systems, and if all of that software is perfectly built and connected, it still doesn't automatically tell you what skills your employees have. And so no company, I've never interacted with a company that actually has mapped all of their employees' skills perfectly in their opinion, let alone, from an external reviewer. And so I think that's the first gap. There's no question. I also think ensuring that employees have the diversity of means of training and are encouraged to do it in the right ways is extremely rare and important. So as an example, LinkedIn is super generous in paying for post-secondary education opportunities outside of LinkedIn, like the online learning that Benoit was mentioning. Major employers have been famous for in the past, and Walmart and Amazon each have their own universities now, one guild run, one internally run, etc. And in all of these cases, the uptake is actually very, very low. The number of folks going through, let alone completing the programs, is very, very low. And I think part of that is because not only do we have to figure out the diversity of means of content, online, offline, in the flow of work, it's separate, in groups, alone, peer-to-peer, et cetera, but we also have to figure out how to motivate folks to go through this learning. And it's way harder online than in person to motivate them. And we, interestingly, pedagogically, just haven't cracked that nut completely. We are still learning how to get people excited about learning on the job all the time. And in Canada, that perhaps is our greatest challenge.
So what I'm taking away from this is, first and foremost, in your opinion, this gap, skill sets gap in workforce development is one of the biggest gaps we have as a country that will help us close the competitiveness and productivity gap. So it's really important. Number two, the right way to do this is to focus on skills, actually, not on humans yet, but on skills.
Agreed.
And figuring out what is going to be that bouquet of skills that I need 3 years out in order to successfully compete or to deliver against my mission or whatever. To figure that out. And there are ways and methods to actually go and identify, validate, and have the list of skill sets needed. Then probably using that same whatever methodology you used to do that, you now go and understand what your skills are today. What do you have today, right? That would be sort of the second step. Then you understand the gap. And then closing the gap, what I'm hearing now, closing the gap, there's a whole ecosystem around you to close the gap. An ecosystem will include things such as higher education institutions where you can send your people to attend courses. But what I'm hearing from Benoit, leading organizations that have size and scale and maturity are creating their own institutions, their own academies and universities. Look what I have, what I'm wearing today, Deloitte University. We've got a few of those. But there is also learning management systems, and there's a whole ecosystem around that can provide bespoke educational solutions real time, in short snippets, in courses. So this whole ecosystem, and really this should be approached as one of the pillars of corporate strategy, because it's really that important at the end of the day, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. Now, absolutely.
I wanted to touch, given, of course, most of the people who listen to this channel are technologists or tech curious folks. I wanted to talk a little bit about what leading organizations are doing as it relates to attracting and developing specifically tech talent, right? I'd love to get your perspectives on that, both Jake and Benoit. So let's maybe close with that.
I mean, it's fascinating how it's changed over the years, because when I founded with my three co-founders, all of whom are actually still running Lighthouse Labs 14 years ago, something like that. Actually, we started 14 years ago, we started the software company. The bootcamp just had its 10th anniversary. And at that point, as Andreessen Horowitz was saying, software was eating the world. We couldn't find enough software developers. The whole world was obsessed with creating jobs in one specific sector, tech, and specifically even within tech, software developers. And yet that has changed dramatically, in part because post-secondaries and others have really ramped up the production of developers. The advent of boot camps like Lighthouse Labs has changed it as well. But also governments have really begun funding education and skills development, even upskilling, in a bunch of specific, more narrow tech areas. Data science and AI still hyper in demand. And yet, if you look at others, cybersecurity, massively in demand, but we're pumping out a ton of junior talent. In many of these, the hard part is we can't get the senior talent. We're flooding the market with junior folks, and we have to rapidly get them, to the point of this conversation, upskilled, probably ideally on the job, to the point where they are those intermediate cybersecurity or AI or data experts who can power the digital economy.
I think what I've seen changing also is that I think a few years ago, the idea was that technology skills was about IT and people working in IT. And because now even people working in shops and manufacturing environment are using computer or digital and data and AI in one way or another. It means now everybody is a digital worker to certain degrees, which means that the upskilling is happening beyond the IT function. So we have more and more conversation with client about how to manage this internal learning ecosystem for whom IT is a very important client, but it has to expand beyond. You need your executive to understand technology. You need your frontline to have another understanding, and you need to keep developing your software developers for sure. But these are very different clientele internally. So it's about building the right path for them and getting them the level of digital fluency that they need. This, we see that as something that's front and center for a lot of organization. Sometimes, though, interestingly, the request would come from IT and sometimes from HR. And our typical advice is you should talk because you don't want to have just one hand and not talking to the other, right? You want to have it as a joint effort because it's a co-ownership.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Very good. Very good.
I wonder,
Yeah.
there's one or two questions in the chat that I thought we might want to get to
Please.
as well. In particular, I thought there was a question around how we, in an SMB or more generally, create the imagination, the innovation, the creativity skills, endow those skills. And I think that's a great example of how you can't just consume content. Rather, you have to engage with the content, with the learning. You have to be active and do something in order to learn many of the human skills in particular, and certainly to evaluate them. And so as an example, problem solving is one of the ways that I would recommend increasing creativity in an organization, and connecting them to other organizations is another way, because they can, of course, share learnings, different ways of doing the same thing across those organizations. In fact, this ties to another one of the questions in the chat, which asked how small organizations can borrow or extract productivity from others from an ecosystem. And I think you, in essence, answered your own question. Build that ecosystem, take advantage of other SMBs doing the same kind of work within your board of trade or chamber of commerce, or resources that they're providing to your specific kinds of organizations. We live in a country where we actually have far more resources available to SMBs than they take advantage of. So Export Development Canada has resources to help companies go abroad. Business Development Canada has resources for loans here at home. And yet, again, if you look at the uptake across all of those organizations, there is actually more being offered than being accepted.
And I think, so this is another very, very critically important thing to highlight and reemphasize, because actually I agree with you on that front. I've experienced this personally in sort of my working with my clients, that there is a lot that provincial governments and federal governments are actually doing, but it is not easily accessible, or it is not intuitive. So people actually do need to spend time, calories, in figuring out what is available. I think that's another characteristic of our system. Just like our characteristic of our system is that generally we are seen as risk averse, right? There are actually resources available. This has been a fantastic conversation. I think that the call for action, I would love to ask you to think about and let me know, what would you suggest ought to be the calls for actions for people who are in position to help shape their organization's learning strategy, continuous workforce development strategy? Like, maybe I'll ask you, Jake, first for your real-time reflection, and then Benoit, over to you to wrap us up.
Sure. I think off the top of my head, I would say use the lessons from this conversation and the many others that echo it, that we are echoing, as evidence for your most senior leaders, for the CEO, that in the top 3 priorities for every company in Canada, training should rank. And then take the subsidiary lessons that we offered in order to actually deliver that training, because whether it's from the other members of your ecosystem, whether it's from free resources coming from the government or otherwise, or whether it's actually just taking advantage of the talent that already exists within your company, the vast majority of Canadian companies have access to almost everything they need in order to train their employees better. They're just not doing it.
Yeah, and I guess that would be my call for action. You know, trust your own people. There's vast amount of knowledge and enduring human capabilities that are already there. If you can just give them a chance to shine a little bit, go beyond the job description. Don't be tied to a limiting view of human beings. I think you can create a lot of potential.
Wonderful. Benoit, thank you very much. Jake, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to spend this hour with you and learn from you. This is a really important topic. For the audience members, of course, the session will be posted on LinkedIn later on today. And tomorrow, May 22nd, 2024, please join me at the same time, same channel. I will be welcoming David Markwell, the Chief Information and Analytics Officer with Loblaws Group of Companies, talk about his career leadership development. It'll be a masterclass in tech leadership. So please join us tomorrow. With that, I want to wish you a very, very happy Tuesday and all the very best. Thank you.